Senator Pate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and allow me to join our colleagues in congratulating you on being in this role and taking on such a vital and important position, not just for yourself, but for all of us. It reflects so well on this place. Thank you so much. Honourable Senators, I also rise to speak in support of Bill C-226 today. Many examples of environmental racism have already been spoken about at length, most recently just by Senator Bernard, but also by Senators McCallum, Senator Klein, and Senator Odette. Their excellent interventions underscore the depth and breadth of this issue throughout the country. And as Senator McCallum so clearly articulated last week, and Senator Bernard just did, environmental racism is one facet of the much broader intersectional use of systemic racism. Systemic racism both exacerbates and facilitates intersecting forms of racism to flourish and effectively normalizes and too often desensitizes the general population to its very existence and effects. In other words, environmental racism is not experienced in isolation, nor is it unintended. It can go unnoticed, however, as its consequences are rarely felt by those in the most privileged positions or locations. Too often we witness deliberate decisions, sometimes characterized as necessary or political compromises, whereby environmental devastation is permitted in what are often referred to as quote-unquote sacrifice zones, communities that are largely out of sight and out of mind from the general public. Such decisions are rooted in and fuel geographic racism. On a global scale, environmental racism is the logic by which particular communities, nations, and places, often racialized, experience the most harsh consequences of climate crises. We see it in terms of the historical and ongoing seizure of land and resources that privileges the convenience and access of those with the most, from such examples as the raising of poor and racialized communities, like Africville that was just spoken about, as well as green spaces for the construction of highways, airports, and industry. Pollutive infrastructure has been purposely built in, over, or adjacent to the backyards of poor, Indigenous, and Black communities, with seemingly little regard for the impact of toxic pollutants on the respiratory or heart health of inhabitants, not to mention the racist and class-biased disregard for the corresponding proliferation of cancers and other diseases. Last week, as I flew over Saskatchewan and into Alberta, the devastating forest fires raging in the west were top of mind. The consequences of these forest fires are immediate and devastating for Indigenous peoples and those in rural communities. The havoc wreaked will affect many people for decades to come. Many have lost their homes with nowhere to go. Many will never financially recover from these losses and will require financial supports. For many, the trauma they have experienced will require a lifetime of mental aid and support. These forest fires are part of our climate crisis and are predictable direct byproducts of our colonial privileging of individualistic profiteering and the pursuit of wealth through industries and the use of technology. The climate crisis is directly increasing both the severity and the frequency of forest fires, and the resulting environmental, financial, and personal devastation is disproportionately negatively impacting the most marginalized, racialized, and disadvantaged. Neither the trauma and hardship experienced nor the remedial resources or relief are equitably distributed. Indigenous communities are clearly signaling this. The day I arrived in Edmonton, Carol Johnston, a resident of East Prairie Métis settlement, was in the media describing her concerns that the communities closer to Edmonton and central Alberta were getting more attention than the northern Indigenous communities destroyed by fire, describing how the burning of 4 houses near Drayton Valley was all over the media, whereas the loss of 14 homes in the East Prairie settlement did not even initially warrant a mention, despite the reality that the community was in dire straits. Similarly, dozens of homes destroyed in Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation and Fox Lake in Little Red River Cree Nation received virtually no attention. The province has called on the federal government to act, but neither jurisdiction seems to have taken seriously the notice that a dozen Indigenous communities are currently affected or under threat from these wildfires. Neither the province nor the federal government seemingly want to take responsibility for the crisis they have both played a part in creating. To her credit, the Federal Minister of Indigenous Services recognized that there were at least 150 homes and community infrastructure lost and over 4,000 evacuees. Yet we are hearing virtually nothing about support efforts. For the few we do know of, we are hearing that Indigenous peoples are having issues accessing the limited funding because they do not have sufficient identification, including identification that states they are an Alberta resident. For those who are displaced, it is often far from their communities to places they have never been. High-level Mayor Crystal McAteer recently explained, and I quote, "Many of our evacuees come from the reserves that, like Fox Lake, for example, are remote. So a lot of the people that have never left Fox Lake before, a lot of the elders, they speak Cree. Same with the Dene communities. They speak Dene. They don't speak any other language. With no central evacuation centres or adequate culturally safe and specific resources, families and communities are also often separated. These communities, already devastated by immeasurable loss, effectively lose their support systems, further exacerbating their traumatic experiences. If this was anomalous, we might be less concerned. But remember the wildfires in British Columbia in 2021? Lytton First Nation was all but destroyed, and there was no help provided and no plan to help those most in need. As Chief Matt Pascoe so chillingly reminded us then, quote, "They had processes in place for our cattle, but none for Ingla-Pamuk people." 2 years later, their community is still grappling with rebuilding while having to take on the burden of again preparing for wildfire season. They are still in severe drought conditions and at risk of another wildfire. It took 19 months for the Lytton First Nation community store to open, a temporary grocery store for the residents of the community. Before that, community members were driving upwards of 3 hours, traveling as far as Kamloops to buy essential food items. They are still waiting for permanent reconstruction to begin. The Mayor of Lytton, Denise O'Connor, has said, quote, "It's been extremely frustrating. We've been asking specifically for times and dates, but it's just not there. We're just not getting it," end quote. These communities are already struggling with overcrowding, lack of funding, inadequate health care, and overall deficit in social, housing, economic, and health supports. Environmental crises create additional hardships and responsibilities for already struggling communities, further disadvantaging them and perpetuating the cycle of systemic inadequacies, distrust, and the racism they face. Last year, the Auditor General of Canada reported on this issue. The stark findings? Number one, Indigenous Services Canada did not provide the support First Nations communities needed to manage emergencies such as floods and wildfires, which are happening more often and with greater intensity. Two, they found that the department's actions were more reactive than preventative, despite the proactive identification by First Nations communities of many infrastructure projects to mitigate the impact of emergencies. In fact, there was a backlog of 112 eligible infrastructure projects waiting to be funded. Three, worse yet, the Auditor General found that many issues had not been addressed or improved since they had first identified them in their 2013 audit of emergency management on reserves. And four, the department also did not know whether First Nations received services that were culturally appropriate and comparable to emergency services provided in municipalities of similar size and circumstance because it did not identify or consistently monitor the services or level of services to be provided to First Nations. Minister Hadji said it's clear that First Nations sit on the front lines of this environmental crisis, which has astronomical costs tied to evacuation, emergency accommodation, and rebuilding of communities and livelihoods. Yet we continue to do little or nothing to meaningfully support these communities and fail to take proactive steps to deal with the issue. In short, the lack of a national strategy and the focus on reactive rather than preventative measures continues the privileging of those communities of the most privileged. Just one of the many examples and forms of environmental racism that persists in Canada and that we must address. Let's please get this to committee and continue the work. Miigwech, merci. Thank you.